London, February 12, 1682. The heart of Pall Mall. A luxury carriage rolls down the dimly lit street, carrying one of the wealthiest men in all of England, a man worth so much fortune he was literally nicknamed Tom of 10,000. Out of the pitch-black night, 3 heavily armed horsemen surround the carriage, cutting off any escape. A blunderbuss is shoved directly through the glass window. 4 heavy lead balls tear through the darkness, shattering the silence and ripping into the flesh of the man inside. Before the sun would rise the next morning, England's most coveted bachelor would be lying dead in a pool of his own blood. This wasn't a random street robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a desperate mugging by street thieves. It was a cold, calculated, high-society assassination, orchestrated by a foreigner. Count over a teenage heiress and the greatest fortune in the realm. Welcome back to the channel. Today we delve into one of the most harrowing murder cases of late 17th century Britain, the assassination of Thomas Thynne. In this deep dive, we will unravel a dark web of forced teenage marriages, unimaginable elite wealth, jealousy, and a brutal execution carried out in broad daylight. We will look at how an obsession with power led to an international manhunt, a high-stakes trial, and a massive cover-up that reached all the way to the royal court of King Charles. 2. Grab your headset, lock your doors, and let's enter the dark file of 1682. To understand why Thomas Thynne had a massive target on his back, you first have to understand the sheer scale of his wealth. In the late 1600s, holding land meant holding ultimate power. Thomas inherited Longleat House, a massive estate in Wiltshire, along with vast tracts of land across the country. His annual income from rents alone exceeded £10,000 a year, equating to millions of dollars in pure passive income today. It earned him the famous moniker, Tom of 10,000. Thynne was not just rich, he was politically dangerous. He was aligned with the Whig Party and a close personal friend of James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of King Charles. Horace Monmouth was locked in a bitter struggle for the English throne, and Thynne was using his vast fortune to fund these movements. Naturally, this made Thomas Thynne a man with very powerful enemies. But it wasn't political ideology that sealed his fate. It was a forced marriage to a 15-year-old child heiress named Lady Elizabeth Ogle. Lady Elizabeth was the sole heir to the immense Percy family fortune, making her the most sought-after bride in Europe. In 1681, her family arranged a marriage between Elizabeth and Thomas Thynne to combine 2 massive fortunes. But Elizabeth utterly despised Thynne. Immediately after the wedding ceremony, before the marriage could be consummated, the terrified 15-year-old fled England to the Netherlands. While hiding in the Netherlands, the young Lady Elizabeth became the center of attention in European high society. Despite being legally married to Thomas Thynne, she was living as a fugitive bride, desperate to escape a life with a man she abhorred. Her immense wealth made her a prime target for opportunistic suitors across the continent. Enter Count Karl Johann von Königsmarck. Königsmarck was a dazzling Swedish nobleman, a famed military adventurer, and a man who always got exactly what he wanted. He was charming, dangerous, and utterly ruthless. When Königsmarck crossed paths with the young Percy heiress, he became fiercely obsessed. It wasn't just her youth that captivated his dark imagination. It was the astronomical fortune tied directly to her name. If he could marry Elizabeth, he would instantly secure one of the greatest estates in Europe. There was just one massive problem standing in his way: Thomas Thynne. By the strict laws of 17th century England, Thynne was legally Elizabeth's husband. Annulments were nearly impossible to obtain, and a formal divorce was out of the question. Königsmarck realized that if he wanted the girl and the gold, he had to remove the husband permanently. The Swedish count was not a man who ever got his own hands dirty. As a wealthy aristocratic commander, he knew how to orchestrate extreme violence from the shadows. In early 1682, Königsmarck began assembling a specialized hit squad. He didn't hire common street thugs. He recruited hardened military mercenaries who were ruthlessly loyal to him. The lethal crew was led by Captain Christopher Vratz, a fiercely devoted soldier. Vratz was joined by Lieutenant John Stern, a battle-hardened veteran, and a Polish mercenary named Charles George Borowski. Borowski was brought in specifically for his unmatched skill with heavy firearms. This was a highly organized assassination ring, funded entirely by Swedish aristocratic money and aimed directly at London's elite. In late January 1682, the mercenaries slipped quietly into England, setting up a secret base of operations. Königsmarck himself traveled to London under a false name, hiding in an obscure lodging to oversee the plot without being tied to the impending violence. The assassins spent days tracking Thomas Thynne. They studied his daily routines and his favorite routes through the city. They knew that Thynne frequently traveled through the upscale district of Pall Mall in his luxurious carriage. The deadly trap was set. They just needed the perfect night to strike. On Sunday, February 12th, the cold winter fog rolled into the streets of London. Captain Vratz, Lieutenant Stern, and Borowski mounted their horses, loading their weapons with heavy lead. As the clock struck 8 on that freezing Sunday evening, Thomas Thynne's carriage turned onto the cobblestones of Pall Mall. Thynne was relaxed, leaning back against the plush velvet interior, completely unaware that his every move was being watched through the thick winter mist. Standing on the footboard behind the carriage was his personal servant, holding a torch to illuminate. Suddenly, the clip-clop of heavy horse hooves shattered the silence. Out of the darkness rode Captain Vratz, Lieutenant Stern, and Charles George Borowski, galloping at full speed to block the carriage's path. Before the coachman could process what was happening, Vratz forced his horse directly in front of the team, bringing the heavy vehicle to a sudden. The servant behind the carriage screamed, but it was already too late. Vratz looked inside the window, pointed his finger directly at Thynne, and shouted a single word to his Polish hitman, Borowski. "Shoot!" Borowski didn't hesitate. He thrust the short, wide barrel of his blunderbuss directly through the glass window, just inches from Thynne's chest. A terrifying explosion ripped through the quiet night air. The blunderbuss was loaded with 4 massive, jagged lead balls. All 4 balls struck Thomas Thynne at point-blank range, tearing through his torso and devastating his internal organs. The force of the blast blew out the opposite carriage window, filling the air with heavy gunpowder smoke and screams of agony. The coach horses reared up in sheer terror, but the assassins were already moving. Without checking to see if their target was dead, all 3 horsemen spun their mounts around and vanished into the labyrinth of dark London alleys, leaving behind a scene of pure rushed to the wrecked carriage. Inside, Tom of 10,000 was slumped in his seat, bleeding profusely. News of the horrific attack spread through London like wildfire. By midnight, King Charles II himself was notified. The king was furious and terrified. An assassination of this magnitude on a prominent politician in the heart of London was in direct insult. The king immediately ordered every city gate shut and declared a massive rewards program for any information. A citywide manhunt began that very night. Doctors fought desperately to save Thynne's life, operating for hours to remove the heavy lead, but the internal damage was simply too severe. At 6 o'clock the following morning, February 13, 1682, Thomas Thynne succumbed to his horrific wounds and died, sending shockwaves across the entire Kingdom of England. The news of Thomas Thynne's death sent absolute shockwaves through the royal court of King Charles II. Never before had such a high-profile, ultra-wealthy politician been brutally executed in broad daylight on the streets of London. The king, knowing that political tension was already at a boiling point, realized that if the killers weren't caught immediately, public outrage could spark riots. He personally took control of the investigation, ordering a massive citywide dragnet and offering a heavy cash reward for any lead. London's law enforcement worked around the clock, locking down every major exit route from the city. Their first major breakthrough came within 24 hours. A local groom recognized one of the horses used during the getaway and led investigators to a small hidden lodging house. On the night of February 13th, armed guards stormed the building, surprising the 3 mercenaries inside. Captain Christopher Vratz, Lieutenant John Stern, and Charles George Borowski were captured without a single shot being fired. When interrogated, the mercenaries initially claimed it was a duel gone wrong. But under intense pressure from the royal magistrates, the weak link broke. Lieutenant Stern cracked, admitting that they hadn't acted out of personal malice. They were following strict orders. He revealed the shadowy mastermind behind the hit, Count Karl Johann von Königsmarck. Word quickly reached the Count that his hired hitmen were in chains and had exposed his name. Realizing the net was closing in, Königsmarck panicked. He disguised himself in a black wig and rough sailor's clothes, fleeing London under the cover of darkness. He made his way to the port city of Gravesend, desperately trying to board a Swedish vessel bound for Europe, but the king's scouts were already one step ahead. On February 19th, as Königsmarck attempted to step onto a boat in disguise, royal officers surrounded him and dragged the Swedish aristocrat into custody. The scandal was now the biggest news in Europe. A wealthy foreign count, 3 foreign mercenaries, and the brutal murder of England's richest bachelor. On February 27, 1682, the trial opened at the Old Bailey, attracting massive crowds, lords and high society elites. However, the trial was far from fair. Count Königsmarck possessed something his mercenaries lacked: immense royal influence and deep pockets. He hired the finest legal minds in London to build a cunning defense, claiming he was completely innocent and that his captain, Vratz, had organized the hit independently to defend his honor. The trial reached a tense and scandalous conclusion. Count Königsmarck's high-level connections, including private pressure from King Charles II, who wanted to avoid a diplomatic nightmare with Sweden, heavily influenced the proceedings. The judge presented a distinctly biased summary to the jury. While the 3 mercenaries were found guilty of willful murder, Count Königsmarck was shockingly acquitted of all charges due to lack of direct evidence. The aristocratic mastermind walked out of the courtroom a free man, leaving his hired hands to pay the ultimate price. On March 10, 1682, a massive crowd gathered at Pall Mall, the exact site of the assassination. Captain Christopher Vratz, Lieutenant John Stern, and Charles George Borowski were brought to the gallows. Borowski and Stern showed deep remorse, praying for forgiveness, while Vratz remained cold, proud, and defiant to his final breath. All 3 were hanged, and Borowski's body was later hung in chains as a grim warning to future criminals. Count Königsmarck fled England immediately after his release, but his dark ambition for Lady Elizabeth's fortune failed completely. Horrified by the bloodshed and public scandal, Elizabeth refused to ever see or speak to the Count again. Months later, she married Charles Seymour, the 6th Duke of Somerset. As for Königsmarck, his violent life met an equally violent end just 4 years. Later, he was killed in action during the Siege of Argos in 1686. Thomas Thynne was buried in Westminster Abbey, where his grand marble tomb still stands today. Carved onto the base is a detailed depiction of his fatal carriage ambush. Forever capturing the knight Tom of 10,000 was struck down in cold blood. This dramatic historical case reminds us how greed, obsessive power, and unbridled ambition can turn high society into a deadly battlefield. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical crime and aristocratic scandal, please make sure to hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more dark, forgotten files from history. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Do you think King Charles II actively protected the Count? Let's discuss it in the comments below. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for the next